Hey guys, this is miicrow. I have been requested to do an updated defensive perk tier list, and it seemed like a pretty good time to do so with newer players starting to look at the game. Got the announcement coming up, so older players are, doing their like kind of last second gear preps before New World League and like all these other kind of random factors. It seems like a decent time to do this. Generally speaking, right now, defensive perks are in a spot where I think some of them are pretty significantly overhyped and a lot of others are underrated. We've kind of flip flopped historically back and forth between which ones are best, which ones are worse. But I kind of wanted to like just look at it from like a math perspective today and just like, hey, this perk will just literally just make you tankier. Like it's not personal. Some of these perks are just better than other ones. Generally speaking, there are a few different categories that these perks fall into. We have health oriented perks. These ones either just give you health or they're based off your max health. There are base damage oriented perks that reduce off of base damage. There are ABS perks which reduce off of old fortify. This is called ABS in the back end, so I'm just abbreviating it with that. Then we have fortify perks, and those are the main four types. Health perks, I would say, are generally on the decline or neutral. Base damage perks are on the decline, they're not as good. ABS oriented perks are very good right now. Fortify perks, I think, are kind of neutral and are on a slight increase in getting more popular, and that's kind of where stuff stands. There are definitely, excuse me for the cough, I'm still getting over that. But there are definitely some underrated perks here that are definitely like worth taking a look at, and I kind of wanted to go through that here. So let's start off here with the tier list. I wanted to start off with like some of the more, you know, classic perks, like you don't really have to think about them too much. So let's start with health. Health is excuse me, is a perk where it's good if you are a tank. It's basically health is good for surviving burst. That's the main goal of health. If you're in a spot where you're not being healed and you just want to survive burst damage, health is good. So it's nichely good for a few different roles. Tank is a role that is really good with health. Another role that's really good with health is like super squishy builds, particularly with in light. That wasn't spelled super great, but those are the two main builds I think about with health. Everything else, like you basically don't want to run health now. I would say health is generally in a lot worse spot than we originally evaluated it at. Originally, when this perk came out, everyone thought it was really good. Then we did some math and it was like, wait, health is actually not as good. And now some people are like, hey, health is really good, and other people are like, hey, health is like not very good, and there's kind of two different camps there. But it does have its purpose with a few different builds. I would probably put health in between B and C tier, probably like lower B, higher C. I'm probably gonna stick it in B for now. We might adjust it as we go. It definitely has its purpose, but it wouldn't say it's like super great for everything in the game is at this point. Do we? How do we want to start with this? I think we just tackle Shirking Fort first because this is the one that's kind of like off on its own. Shirking Fort is the one fortify oriented perk. Oh, actually no, we should do Shirking Heals first because that's a heal oriented perk, and then we can go to Shirking Fort, right? Yeah, I think that's a little bit more balanced. So let's talk about Shirking Heals. Shirking Heals is interesting because this perk I think is really strong right now, but it's not because the perk itself is strong, it's because Healing Breeze procs off of this perk, and that's the main purpose of Shirking Heals. Actually, stacking Shirking Heals is like good in small scale. I don't know if I'd say it's insane, but it's like it's a good like kind of third perk option. I wouldn't say it's like the best perk that you run. It's not the perk that you're like, oh, I need to run Shirking Heals. It's kind of like a, hey, what do I want as my last slot there? It's like, oh yeah, we could throw in a Shirking Heals kind of thing. So it's good. I think it's better than health. And it's just generally useful because it procs the Healing Breeze perk, which is like one of the strongest perks in the game in terms of solo survivability. So for that being said, I'm gonna put Shirking Heals an A tier right now. I think it's a very solid option to go for a lot of these builds. Let's do Shirking Fort next. Shirking Fort is the only fortify oriented perk that we have right now. I think this is the most underrated perk in the game right now. This will kind of save headache down the road, but I think Shirking Fort is basically better than every single base damage reduction perk right now for every single medium and heavy class across the board. For light classes with featherweight and without featherweight, I feel a little bit sketchy recommending Shirking Fort because I think those classes are classes that you usually stand in a spot. You're not actively using your dodge to dodge attacks or using your dodge for movement. And because you're doing that, it's not going to proc. And it also has less of a weight because you're in a lighter class. So I wouldn't consider it for those classes, but for classes where you would consider running Shirking Fort and for everything across the board, I think Shirking Fort right now is an A tier perk oriented perk where it's very, very solid, but not game breaking in any means. It's just like one of those perks where it makes more sense to run this in a base damage reduction perk right now because base damage reduction is super, super, super high. And those, excuse me, those base damage reduction perks are getting like roughly 1/2 the value that they says they are in their tooltip. In terms of Shirking Fort and converting this to global reduction towards every single effect, in heavy, this is close to 1/2. In medium, this is about 2/5 of the value, and then in light, it's about 1/3. So it's generally best for these heavy and medium rolls. Featherweight is somewhere between medium and light. I forget the exact amount, but it's really good for heavy, medium rolls. If you have a shield, it gets even better than 1/2. I think it's like close to like 3/5 basically. So heavy with SNS basically, and it's just very solid for those. So yeah, I'm gonna put that in the A tier and kind of leave that there for now. I think we do excuse me, we do conditional perks, and then we start looking at base damage oriented perks and kind of circle back around to ABS at the end. So we could talk about Freedom next. Freedom fell off, to put it bluntly. Not a lot of people are trying to run this anymore. A lot of people are trying to hit 300 dex. For people that don't know what 300 dex does, it is an attribute bonus that if you hit it and then you switch weapons, it will just remove all CC effects, which basically makes it so you don't have to run Freedom anymore. People also tend to run Hatchet as an offhand so they don't have to run Freedom. But people also run Stone Form so they don't have to run Freedom. People also run Purifying Heart so they don't have to run Freedom. A lot of people are finding ways to move away from Freedom. It feels dated, feels weak, and honestly probably needs a buff to where it doesn't just work off a base duration but works off a total duration, and then I think it will be in a pretty good spot. But with everything where it is right now, I'd probably put Freedom in C tier to the point where it's usable. I know a few builds that still consider running it, like Bruiser still considers running it, but that's like the only one that comes to mind really. Everyone else is like, yeah, we have other ways to get away from these effects now. Freedom is a little bit dated at this point. We don't really need it as much. Invigorated is also one of those perks where it's in a weird spot where I don't think it's that useful because it works off of the base duration. I'm sorry for the cough, guys. Give me like 2 seconds. Okay, we should be good. Invigorated works off of base duration as well. It works for weaken, disease, exhaust, rend. These are really, really good effects to get rid of, and I think Invigorated mostly shines in spots where Cleanse Pot is not active, so basically not in war. You talk about solo Q OPR, Invigorated's very, very good, because it just counters most of those disease perks, and you just naturally stay free of those effects that can kill you, but you need a healer for this perk to be good. It's kind of conditional, and I think it will be used more in the future in terms of like solo environments, but for now, definitely not popular. I don't see it being any more popular recently. It's a very niche perk, and I would continue to put that in that C tier. I think you can make an argument that this is B tier. It's a little bit better than Freedom, so maybe we'll put it to the left of Freedom so that signifies it's a little bit better. But it's not like that great right now, and I don't think that will change anytime soon. Vigor, I don't think we need to talk about very much. We don't really. I guess we could pull it up just so people can see it if they are not familiar with what Vigor does. This perk just isn't useful, and the reason why it's not useful is it works off a base again. So anything that has an attribute bonus, so like 150 dex is attribute bonus that extends the damage over time effects. It's gonna make it so that perk doesn't even work versus it. You look at int 250 damage over time effects, perk doesn't work versus it. So it's like you could run the perk, but like it's not going to do what you want it to do versus the builds that you want it to work versus. Like if you get hit by a crippling powder burn musket, the dot is still going to tick for 20 years. Like, it's not going to help you there. And for that reason, Vigor is, like, not really a good counter to the builds that are dot oriented. And for that reason, it's, like, not good. There's not really a reason to run it. If you want to reduce the damage from those dot builds, you might as well not go Vigor and just try to actually reduce the damage of the hit, which reduces the damage of the dots, and then you just feel better about yourself with that down the road. So let's talk about base damage reduction perks now. Actually, let me give a quick drink of water real quick and try to keep this cough at bay. Okay. Now we talk about base damage reduction perks. Elemental Aversion is the first one we'll talk about here. Elemental Aversion is probably the most popular base damage reduction perk right now. It is very consistent. It is not very good at mitigating damage. It is very consistent, though. Versus Fire Staff, even though this says 4.5%, this is basically 2.25% reduction to just Fire Staff and to just Bow. Versus Detonate, it is 4.5% because it isn't affected by base damage, and that's where I think it actually gets pretty strong. But versus most effects in the game, it's like actually not that good. Like, you're better off running Shirking Fort, and because IGVG I don't think is in a very strong spot right now as a class as a whole, it's like in the weakest spot it's ever been since it's come out. I would argue that Shirking Fort's probably better than Elemental Aversion in most cases. I would put this perk as like a very solid option, but it's not insane. I would put it in B tier. I'd say it's a little bit better than Health for most builds, but it's not that good, if that makes sense. Elemental Aversion, or sorry, Enchanted Ward is another one of those base damage reduction perks that I think needs a little bit of love. The light and heavy attack part is useful, except for like versus a bow that does a light or heavy attack. Like, you might as well just go Elemental Aversion because they're all going for the lightning bow anyway, because it just does more damage since everyone's gemming super hard to thrust right now. So you're just better off going Elemental Aversion because it just resists more and has more coverage versus other matchups. And if you want to do a combination of both, like you have like Frigid Dawn gear or something like that, it's decent, but I think it's worse than ABS oriented perks, which we'll get to later in this video. But it's not like awful, if that makes sense. Like, I would put it in a spot right now where this perk, I wouldn't put it in B tier. I don't think it's as good as Elemental Version. I don't think it's as good as Health. I would put it at the top of C tier. I think it's better than Invigorate. I think it's better than Freedom, but I don't think it's a very good perk at all right now. It's okay, though. Grit Ward is another one of those perks where I think when it first came out, we're all kind of hyped. And then we took a step back, and then we thought about it, and we were like, huh, if I want my Grit Ward to work, I need 300 con. I might as well just go 350 con and get the passive Grit Ward. And then it's like, why do I need the Grit Ward perk if I already have passive Grit Ward? Like, I want to make sure I have some resistance if I'm not swinging as a melee person. And it felt like you were doing too much if you were going for this Grit Ward on top of the 350 con, if that makes sense. So for that, I wouldn't say it's a very good perk. I think it's worse than all these other perks that we've mentioned so far. I think it situationally can be better than Enchanted Ward, but it's not usually. And I'd say it's a little bit better than Freedom, but it's worse than Invigorated. I would put it in that C tier as well. Okay, so now we get to the fun part where we start talking about conditionings. Conditionings are either insane or basically useless, and it depends how you ward your gems, if that makes sense. So if I do, like, a really common split that I do, for example, is I do 5 towards my physical. So let's break this up. So we have our physical gems, right? We have physical, we have elemental. For our physical, there are 3 categories of gems. There's a slash, let's just do S for slash. There's thrust, and then there's strike. Those are your 3 things that you're warding versus. Elemental, there's honestly a bunch, and I don't think we need to go through that. But generally, how people ward right now is they go full into elemental, So they'll do like 10 to 15% elemental, they'll do 5 to 10% to physical, and then they'll use conditionings on the physical side to supplement their gems. There are certain builds that you don't need to do this though. Like if you are just worried about fire damage from the elemental side, what some people will do is they'll just go into all of these physicals by just running an Onyx. So you do all of these, and then you just run fire here. But then you're weak to matchups like Bow, which is typically running a lightning gem. Fire Staffs are also doing a conversion to different elements now. So you're not like strong versus everything, but you're good versus melee oriented matchups. So it kind of depends on your setup. But with that being said, we can kind of rank the conditionings in terms of what's best. I guess before we rank conditionings, I did forget to rank physical aversion. Physical aversion is not useful. It's in a F tier along with vigor. I don't think we need to talk about that much. But people are going elemental damage with bows and muskets right now. Like, there's not really a good point to be using physical aversion when you have elemental aversion, because elemental aversion just has more coverage than physical aversion. Physical aversion also doesn't work versus most abilities, and elemental aversion works versus a few abilities. They did adjust that recently, so they tend to work versus more abilities, but elemental aversion just has more coverage. With that being out of the said and like getting that out of the way, let's talk about these. Slash conditioning. This is the best conditioning in the game. The reason why it's the best conditioning in the game is because slash damage hits very consistently. It's not like peaks, and you need to get hit before your conditioning actually procs. So you get hit, your slash conditioning procs, your next hit, it's reduced. And because it's also on its physical side, and there's so many different elemental types right now, this tends to be the thing that people run conditioning for, and I would argue is the best form of conditioning. Thrust conditioning is in a close second, and I would also put it in that S tier because there are a lot of thrust weapons right now. So you tend to be hit by thrust a lot, from whether it be from spear, from bow, because even though bow has a 99% lightning split, it is still doing 1% of thrust, which is still proccing that thrust conditioning, which is really weird. It doesn't really make a ton of sense, but that's how they did the math and the behind the scenes in the game. You have sword and shield, which sometimes does thrust damage for some reason. Also does strike damage for some reason. Also does slash damage for some reason. It does every single type of damage. So there's just like a lot of different things that are really popular right now that you can run thrust conditioning and kind of get that defensive benefit from. Strike conditioning, I would argue, is a little bit weaker, but it's still very, very good. Excuse me. Let me give myself 1 second here. That cough is killing me, but this is what happens when I talk a bit, and I think we need a video about this one. Strike conditioning still is very good. I wouldn't say it's insane, because Warhammer hits very, very hard, does not hit consistently, and you will not have the conditioning proc for when you need it, and there's not that many forms of strike damage, so it just generally has low uptime unless you're like versus flail, which you don't really need to word versus flail. Let's be real, flail doesn't really do damage anyway, so would not say it's the thing that you want to go for usually. Flame conditioning can be good, but I would generally say is weaker than all of these. Fire Staff does exist. It is good versus Fire Staff. It's just gem setup wise, it doesn't make as much sense to go for flame conditioning as it compared to these other things, because usually you're using the elemental side towards opals, and you're running flame pots already. So there's not really a huge point to go to this, and flame pots are just inherently really, really good. Let me look these up for you guys in case you don't know what they are. These are really good because they're affected by your bags, and they last for 45 seconds, even though they say they last for 30 seconds. So if you have the bag thing that increases how long your food lasts, they also boost this, and they just basically are BIS for every single build, and because those are BIS, it reduces the effectiveness of flame conditioning, so it kind of nerfs that a bit. Abyssal is okay because there's a decent amount of void effects. It's just they're not super popular, so I'd probably put that in C. Yeah, there's just not that many void effects, but it's okay, I guess. Like, I wouldn't really consider it over any of these other perks. Frost and the nature one are basically useless. There's just not enough consistent damage from those types. So This is what we ended up with in terms of our tier list. I know the icons are kind of small. I wanted to have the text in there, when in hindsight you can't even read the text. So it wasn't really worth it, and I should have just had the icons. But uh, it is what it is. ABS is on top. These are both ABS oriented perks. Your ABS perks are here on the right. All these are pretty good. They obviously fall off the further you go down the list, but they are generally the most valuable perks in the game. I think Shirking Heals and Shirking Forward are very solid right now. Shirking Heals is used to really good for solo play, also good for group play right now because it procs the Healing Breeze very consistently. Shirking Forward is just your best overall mitigation perk in the game because Void Gauntlet's not as good. It has more coverage than Elemental Version, all these other effects, and when it's up, it just generally protects you for more. But it does have lower uptime than Elemental Version, so you give up some consistency to run it. But for that consistency that you give up, it is a very, very good defensive perk and it'll keep you alive a lot longer. Elemental Version is a very, very solid perk. And kind of a default for most classes. Nothing wrong with it, just not particularly like insane. Good versus everything, very consistent. It's just people have a bunch of base damage, so it's not as good nowadays. It is the best perk versus Detonate, so that does have that going for it. Health, good for Living Burst. There's not... Okay, this is controversial, but there's not a ton of burst in the current meta. Like, for certain spots, there's burst. Like, on a war during a point crash, yes, there's burst. The SNS runs health for that reason because they're in the center of that giant thing. But, like, every other class in the game doesn't need health to live, so it's like, I don't think you really need the health in most cases. Unless you're like a 5-con musket player. But I know some people like to have the health just to like have a little bit of, well, it's a little bit of a crutch. To them, I would say take a leap of faith. Try replacing your health with Elemental Aversion or Enchanted Ward. It will probably feel better, to be honest. But I'll leave it in B tier just because it's like a solid perk. And most of these other perks are just not in a great spot right now, to be honest. So that's kind of where health sits. Enchanted Ward is decent, but not super great. Uh, it just doesn't work versus a ton of abilities. Your autos are also the thing that like aren't what you usually want to ward towards versus in terms of damage wise. Like abilities hit harder than autos. It's like why would you want to ward versus autos? And generally, so that's where I kind of say with that. I think we talked about these other perks enough to where they're not really worth talking about too much more in depth. Let me know if you guys have any different opinions or if I missed like some defensive perks. Like I know I didn't put like the shield defensive perk. If I put that on this list, it'd be at the top of S because it's the best mitigation perk in the game. But like most classes don't have access to that. And let me know what you guys think, and I'll see you in the next one.